Good evening. Welcome to the Algonquin College Speaker Series. I'm Jamie Bramberger alongside, from the Globe and Mail, David Shoalts, who has written a great book called Hockey Fight in Canada, which is the story of the 12-year NHL agreement, broadcast agreement, that Rogers Communications struck with the National Hockey League a few years ago. So welcome to Pembroke, David.
Thank you, Jamie. It's a pleasure to be here.
All right, so let's start here because the backstory is quite fascinating in this. So let's go to 2012, Ottawa, All-Star Weekend, and Brian Burke, at that time general manager of Toronto Maple Leafs, sort of sets the tone for what might be coming in the broadcast negotiations. What happened?
Yeah, it was at every All-Star game in the NHL, there's a Board of Governors meeting, and it's usually just a housekeeping meeting because the All-Star game is sort of roughly the halfway point of the NHL schedule. So it's just considered a fun break for the league. So the governors show up, they would take care of a few housekeeping items, and they would always hear from the CBC about Hockey Night in Canada. And it would be stuff like the CBC would tell them what a wonderful job they were doing with the show, some of the plans they had for the next year or so, and then they'd just convene and go to the next, or break up rather, and go to the next cocktail party. But this time was going to be different because there was really a growing unhappiness among the management of the NHL. That would be the general managers, the presidents of the team, and then the owners as well, of the Canadian teams, I might add. They were getting really unhappy with the CBC. They felt the CBC broadcasts, i.e. Hockey Night in Canada and its panel shows, were biased against management of the NHL. Because the CBC always prided itself on a sort of journalistic approach to covering or carrying the broadcast. So they didn't hesitate to criticize or allow criticism of the league when, the satellite hot stove, you remember that show. But in particular, it was Ron MacLean and Don Cherry who were sort of the focus of the unhappiness. Because Ron had taken to sort of badgering Gary Bettman. I'm sure you guys all look old enough to remember that. Back in the late 2000s, he would badger Gary Bettman about things like the collective agreement, any issue coming up. And Ron felt very strongly that the players' side didn't get voiced enough on these network broadcasts. So he saw it as his duty, I guess you'd speak, from a journalistic standpoint, to bring some balance to this so that it wasn't all management side of things. And that often took the form of him giving Gary Bettman a hard time.
We're going to leave that storyline there because I'm going to actually show a clip. We'll provide that evidence.
And it culminated in this clip you're going to see.
So we'll show that in just a second, but go ahead with the Brian Burke piece, and then I'll bring back the video.
And the other thing was they weren't happy with Don Cherry, who was criticizing, in particular, the Leafs at that time. Brian Burke was running the Leafs. And Cherry would go on and on and on in Coach's Corner about how the Leafs didn't have any good Canadian boys playing on the team, right? Especially ones who were born in Ontario, because they're being run by these friggin' Americans. Like Burke was, this is the funny thing, Burke was the GM. He was born in Minnesota, but he actually has dual citizenship because he lived up here. He ran the Vancouver Canucks. And Ron Wilson, of course, was the coach. Well, Ron Wilson's father was... Larry Wilson, I think. There were two Wilson brothers in the 50s who played for the Detroit Red Wings. Ron's dad was, I believe, Larry, who went on to coach them. Ron was born in Fort Erie, a section of the country I happen to come from, but he grew up basically in the U.S., and he had dual citizenship as well. But Cherry would go on and on about how these guys only wanted to bring in American players. And Burke, it doesn't take much to get him wound up. So, he was getting mad. And then the other teams had their own issues too, for various criticisms. So Burke knew this wasn't going to be another sort of happy backslapping meeting. So he called up Jeffrey Orridge, who at that time was running CBC Sports. And he said, look, I just thought I'd warn you, you're going to get a pretty rough ride this weekend. And Orridge basically he didn't take him seriously enough, or it was worse than even Burke expected. Because basically what happened was Burke was the first one to speak, and he went up one side, the CBC, and down the other. You guys are biased. You don't like it. And Ron MacLean's out of control. Don Cherry's out of control. But the significant thing was that the Vancouver Canucks guys, which I think was Mike Gillis at the time, he was the GM, jumped up as soon as Burke sat down and said, the Vancouver Canucks agree with everything Brian Burke said. Now, to a hockey person, this was something, because Burke and the Canucks hated each other. Burke had been fired by the Canucks a few years earlier, and his assistant and good friend Dave Nonis took over, and then he in turn got fired, and Burke and Nonis both thought that Mike Gillis had a hand in Dave Nonis getting fired, so there was no love lost between these two teams. They absolutely hated each other, and for one of them to jump up after the other and say, we agree with everything they said, would show you how deep the problem was. But neither Kirstine Stewart, who was the head of English television at CBC at the time, nor Jeffrey Orridge, the head of CBC Sports, they weren't hockey people. And they didn't quite realize how important this was, or what it signaled, how deep the unhappiness was. And that was sort of the opening shot across the bow of the CBC as they headed into the following year, the negotiations for the new TV contract. And that was a real sign that this was not going to be an easy negotiation for the CBC.
Okay, so let's go from there. Then we're going to run a clip here. It's about 5 minutes long, but I can remember watching this live. It was the Chicago-Philadelphia Stanley Cup Final in June of 2010, and I can remember feeling rather uncomfortable in the seat watching this.
I don't know if this part's on, but it opened nicely enough.
It did, about his birthday.
It was Bettman's birthday, and
Yes.
Ron MacLean, God love him, sang happy birthday to him at the start of the clip. I don't think it's on this
we
clip.
took that out, but that was the only happy part in the entire
Then
interview.
it very quickly went downhill.
So some of you will remember this, but just watch the tone because it plays into this whole negotiation. So let's roll Ron MacLean. And
Let's start with Gary. In your State of the Union the other day, you said there are no owners giving back the keys.
Correct.
Notwithstanding, you did a great job with Florida when Alan Cohen may have thrown in his keys.
No. We switched general partners. He's still a partner in the club.
He has equity?
Yes.
Oh, good. And with Orange
I'm
Lewis
glad we clarified that.
and Len Berry,
They sold, and they actually got money back.
what did they get? The word on the street is Jeff Winnick, with the assumed debt and the cash, it was anywhere between 80 and 120 million. Is that about right?
Well, I think, first of all, we don't generally publicize what franchises go for, but this franchise, ultimately, when you add up everything, went for what we think franchises are worth, and it's been far more than was reported.
It is?
Oh, yes.
Now, Oren and Len bought for what? Around 200 million?
Somewhere in that vicinity.
Yeah, so is it close to that? I guess just because, you're partner of the players with all the escrow, they're worried about the franchise values and what they're getting and the money that they're spending.
Franchise values has nothing to do with the escrow.
Well, it does in a sense, because if you have a great franchise, you're right.
Thank you.
You're dead right on that. But if the business keeps building revenues and if you go into markets that are healthy and big,
Ron,
go ahead.
We're coming through a recession.
I agree.
5 years of record revenues. Last year, we were up 5% in real dollars, putting aside the difference between the Canadian dollar and the U.S. dollar. This year, we're going to be up again, some of it the Canadian dollar and some of it real dollars. That will be 5 years in a row of record revenues. Not an issue.
No, well, except that
and
would you say the franchise values aren't as high as you'd like to have been? Coming out of the lockout, everything seemed tickety-boo and they were skyrocketing. It looked like Tampa went down.
Reports of the demise, as the quote goes, have been greatly exaggerated. We're actually doing okay.
Okay, how about Dallas? Tom Hicks. Have you been funding the Dallas Stars?
No.
All right. What's he going to do? I hear Bill Gallagher of Calgary wants to buy them. How come he hasn't?
Well, it's a process. You don't buy multi-$100 million assets like you buy a lottery ticket. It requires due diligence. It requires doing a lot of homework. Ultimately, it requires negotiating a purchase and sale agreement. Tom Hicks has had some issues. Obviously, the Texas Rangers are being sold in baseball, and actually they're in bankruptcy. The Stars are not going into bankruptcy, and we anticipate that they'll be sold over the summer.
No, that's fair. But Tom's clearly turning back the keys, right?
No, he's selling the club. He hasn't turned back the keys.
All right. Well, what's the situation with that Gallagher bid? Then you say it's a long process. Sounds like to me it's been about a year and a quarter.
Well, when people do due diligence on a club and they're interested in buying, they typically sign non-disclosure agreements, because when you go through the process, you don't do it out in the public eye. You do your homework, and you're required to keep confidential the information that's going on. Why would I interfere with that process?
All right, St. Louis Blues. What's going on with them? The hedge partner is ready to sell, 5-year exit plan?
Well, there are a lot of clubs that, for example, you didn't mention Carolina, but we'll do that.
Yeah.
No, I'll take care of that.
Okay, good.
Pete Carmano's had a partner. The partner didn't get a whole lot of attention. He was kind of behind the scenes, and he passed away a couple of years ago. Pete is looking to replace his partner. When you recapitalize, either in the case of St. Louis with either a lender or a minority partner who doesn't control the franchise, or in Peter's case, when you look for a new partner, that's not turning back the keys. That's not a crisis. What that is doing a recapitalization. Businesses do that all the time.
Just while you're on Peter Carmanis, the word I hear is he'd love $300 million, but Michael Ozanian of Forbes said he'd be lucky to get 85 because hockey just won't work in Carolina, or it's not hot enough.
With all due respect to Forbes and Michael Ozanian, I think he's been off the mark. What I'm amazed now that we've run the gamut of this, we've had a great season. Hockey has been terrific. These playoffs are great. We're watching a wonderful game, and you just want to tick off franchise after franchise. What inside of you compels you to want to go in that direction? Because I don't believe our viewers are really that interested in the franchise
The players.
status.
I'm doing it for the players. How's that? They're giving us the wonderful show.
When
they're your partners, and we're in the Sun Belt, and we're not going into Southern Ontario.
If that's the case, you do a disservice to the players and the great performances that are out there. Because if the players are interested, the players can ask me.
Well, they're
we don't have.
They're spending 13% in escrow, Gary. They're interested.
That has nothing to do with franchise values.
No, I agree with that, but the business they're interested in.
And the business is growing. And the business has been growing.
Okay, just so you want to, we'll end it on that.
Yeah, that
Gary
was
Bettman's a
something.
lawyer.
Yeah.
That's an interrogation.
That was in 2010. It was a period of pretty large upheaval with some of the franchises in the league. One of Ron's probably, another power failure, just like our TV interview earlier
This
today.
happened to us today. Wow. Okay, let's bring it back up.
Okay. Well, my wife always tells me my voice is so loud you don't need a bloody microphone. But you saw probably Ron's biggest weakness as a broadcaster in that he's such an insider. Like, he just steeped in NHL knowledge. He starts throwing names around that only insiders would know. Like, you heard him refer to Oren and Len. Well, at that time, those two guys owned the Tampa Bay Lightning, and they ran out of money, particularly Len Barry, who was an ex-player, and essentially got forced out as owners of the Tampa Bay Lightning. And the same thing in Florida with a guy named Alan Cohen, who actually had lots of money but realized he was losing $30 million a year running the Panthers, and he said, "I'd rather give the team back to the league for nothing, and that way I'll stop losing $30 million a year." Hence the talk about throwing the keys on the table. But that was Ron, and the same sort of thing was going on in Dallas and St. Louis. It was a tough period, but I'll give Bettman credit. He got out of all those situations. He found new owners, and good ones, and the guy's just amazing like that. He's one of the smartest people I've ever met, and even though he's very combative, as you saw there. Now, after that interview was over, Gary made it known to the CBC that I will never appear on Hockey Night in Canada again as long as Ron MacLean is the host, and he didn't. His next appearance with Ron is when Ron got his job back a couple of years ago that was the big moment. Was like, well, what's going to happen with the first interview with Ron and Gary? And it actually happened during the World Cup of Hockey in the September. You remember the tournament from a few years ago. And it went very well because Ron knew. This time around, his bosses weren't the CBC. His bosses were Rogers, who were very interested in keeping Gary happy.
So let's just look at this. So we've got, that interview is 2010. You can feel the friction between Bettman and MacLean. 2012 comes the Brian Burke volley at the Board of Governors meeting in Ottawa. Then Burke gets fired after there's a lengthy lockout, 500 plus games gone in 13-14. They come back from that, and the Leafs surprise everybody by firing Burke, so he's out of the picture. At the same time, the Harper government, all kinds of cuts to the CBC, so they're reeling from that. So they're not in a really good position to start negotiating a new NHL deal that's going to be a record payment.
No, not at all. I mean, it couldn't have been a worse time for them to have this come up again because in addition to all the problems that we're already facing private broadcasters, like those damn millennials, right, who don't watch TV, they watch YouTube and all that stuff and cut the cord. So viewership was declining, and with it, advertising revenue. But at the same time, oddly enough, the price of these sports properties like the NHL rights, the NFL rights renewed around that time for I think almost double. Like they get the best TV money in the world. It's just unbelievable what those guys get. It's off the top of my head, it's in the book. I think their most recent contract is something close to $40 billion. That's with a B, not an M, a year, from about 4 different networks that they're involved with. And so, an owner in the NFL makes a profit before he even opens a ticket window every year. And because they also, by the way, have a very favorable collective agreement that has a pretty stringent salary cap on the team. And the NFL is I'm going down a tangent here, but the NFL is the one pro league left that player contracts are not guaranteed. So if you sign a contract to be a running back for $10 million a year for 8 years, that may sound good, but they could cut you tomorrow and say, thanks for coming, see you later. But that's sort of the landscape when this contract came up. And the reason sports properties were increasing in value is that they resisted these changing patterns in viewership. I'm sure you've all at one time or another thought, well, I'm at work, I'm doing something or other. I can't watch the game, but I'll record it and watch it later, right? And you know how difficult that is to try and avoid somebody telling you the score of the game. And nowadays with social media and all this other stuff, it's even harder than ever. So it hardly ever happens. So live sports was resistant to this cut in viewership. They still commanded big dollars because advertisers knew that chances were somebody will be sitting in front of that TV to see their commercial. So those prices kept going up. And the CBC was, even before the negotiations started, they were pretty much priced out of the game.
And Gary Bettman pulled off quite a coup, $2 billion over 10 years, the American NBC contract, which was really something for hockey.
It
what's
was
considered a regional sport. So negotiations opened in July 2013. CBC has an exclusive window. You think they made a mistake?
Yeah, I do. Now, it wasn't all entirely their own making because they went into it thinking that this contract was going to be done in the same style the previous ones had been, which is that there were different packages for different broadcasters. So for years, the CBC had Hockey Night in Canada, which was the national broadcasts on Saturday nights, plus the All-Star Game, a few other games on other nights of the week, and the playoffs. That was their deal. They paid $105 million a year by the time their most recent contract ended in 2013. That's what they were paying the NHL. TSN had a separate national contract where they did Wednesday nights for the most part, plus a few other nights a year. They were paying, I think, somewhere in the neighborhood of $80 million a year for that. And then the thinking was that Rogers was going to get in the game on a national level instead of just buying those regional packages. By the way, there is a separation there. A lot of people tend to confuse the two. There are national broadcasts, which usually take up around 22 to 30 games of a team's schedule. They're designated as national games. Those are the ones seen across the country that you can watch on free TV or just on the regular cable channel. Then there's the regional games. Those are the other 60, 62 games. They are sold separately. They're sold to the same people. Either TSN or Rogers buys them. But that's you have to then go buy that package, right? TSN carries the Senators regional games. And I don't know, what do they charge? Somewhere $200 a year or something you're going to have to pay for that to get those games. That's a separate deal from the national deal. This billion-dollar deal we're talking about. It just concerns those national games. And CBC figured, okay, one more time, we're going to be part of a deal where we'll get our Saturday night games. TSN will get their Wednesday, Thursday games, and then Rogers, everybody thought, is going to get Saturday or Sunday nights rather. There'll be a new Sunday night national broadcast, and Rogers will come in for that. And you know what? That's sort of the way the NHL saw it too. But lurking behind all that was a thing called the Gatekeeper Model. And that was what ultimately ended up being sold. That is the model where they take all of the rights, television, digital, radio, stuff that hasn't been invented yet, YouTube, and all in one package and sell it for a huge number to one company. But at that time, they weren't really considering that. They'd looked at it, they'd researched it, but they were really thinking it's going to be another piecemeal deal. And that's when the CBC came along, and they're thinking, well, we'll get our Saturday night package again. But where the CBC made a mistake was they thought it would be the same way as it always was, where they had all of the Canadian teams on Saturday nights. So if you lived in Ottawa, for example, you would get a pretty steady diet in the early game of the Ottawa Senators, right? If you happen to be a Vancouver, or say a Habs fan or a Leafs fan, you couldn't just switch to another channel and watch that game. You could only see it if the CBC, for whatever reason, if the Ottawa was on the road and didn't happen to be playing, that's the only way you could see it. And the CBC tightly controlled that. Every market had its own, like in Winnipeg, all you got were the Winnipeg Jets. And viewers were getting tired of that because the other leagues were making all these games available. But the CBC was thinking this is the way it's going to be. And the NHL right from the start was telling them, no, it's different now. And the NHL, in that exclusive negotiating period we're talking about, said to the CBC, the money involved now is way more than you can afford. And they were talking about the whole package. And they said, but you've been a good partner for 60 years, so we've got a way we think you can still be part of it. And their idea was a scaled-back version of Hockey Night in Canada. They said to Jeffrey Orridge and Neil McEnany, McEnany by then was head of English TV, and they said to them, you'll get 2 games a week, an early game and a late game on Saturday night. And we'll even give you the Leafs for the early game because that's the big ratings draw. But that's all you're going to get. Plus, you'll still get the playoffs. We're going to probably give away more to TSN now, or even Rogers. And you won't get as many of those other special things like All-Star games and all that. And you're going to have to pay more money. At the time, in the last year of the existing contract, the CBC paid $105 million to the NHL. I think I mentioned that today.
You did.
So the NHL was thinking probably something around close to double that. So my best estimate was somewhere around $175 million a year to $200. And they thought, that still gives you a piece of the pie. You can still sell advertising on that and make some money, and you'll still maintain some control over Hockey Night in Canada. And the CBC wasn't interested in that. And they came back at the end of the negotiating period with a sort of status quo offer. In the words of someone who saw the offer, who said their attitude was, if there's a Canadian team playing on a Saturday night, it'll be on the CBC. Whereas the NHL was like, no, we want to show those games on other networks, make them available to more people. So they didn't turn down the CBC at that point. It was the end of August. They just said, okay, thanks, we'll get back to you. But they knew, Bettman and John Collins, who was the head of marketing of the NHL at that time, he and Bettman were the 2 point guys for the league on the negotiations. They knew then that, the CBC guys just don't get it, and it's not going to turn out well for them. And they moved from there to negotiating with TSN and Rogers, and that's when things started to change.
So NHL doesn't even think Rogers is really a serious contender, other than maybe the Sunday night package, because they don't have.
Yeah.
They've got City TV,
Yeah.
which is cable subscribers. They don't have an over-the-air outlet like
Right.
CTV or CBC, which Bell and the CBC has. But Rogers is very crafty. They're kind of laying in the weeds, letting CBC
Yeah.
and Bell Media do their thing. How does that all unfold?
Yeah, and that was intentional. They thought, okay, we're going to be the stealth group here and let them, because what had happened was the CBC, as I mentioned, that gatekeeper model, the reason they weren't really trumpeting that was that they thought the only company that could handle a gatekeeper model was Bell. Because Bell had all the components you needed to handle a gatekeeper model. They had the digital business. Most of all, they had CTV, which rivaled CBC in its coverage across, over-the-air TV network. It wasn't quite as broad as CBC, but it was close. And they had all the cellular business and all that other stuff you need for all that digital stuff. So they only talked to Bell about this gatekeeper thing, and it came up sort of relatively late in the conversation, sometime in October, I think, early October. And Bell actually said, they weren't that interested in it because they thought it was too much hockey for all of their stations, but they thought it would be nice to have the ultimate control of the product. And then they thought we could sell off what we don't want. So they told the NHL, yeah, we'll look at that. And in fact, they came back with an offer of $5.2 billion over 12 years. That sounds familiar. Just wait a sec. And then after Bettman and Collins got done talking to Bell, they went and met with the Rogers guys. At that point, it was Scott Moore and Keith Pelly. Keith Pelly was the president of Rogers Media. Scott Moore was president of Sportsnet. But even more important than that, Scott Moore used to be president of, head of CBC Sports for many years. And also, by the time he was done, CBC Revenue, which is their advertising revenue department. And Scott Moore had a very good relationship with Gary Bettman. He knew, inside out what was going on there. And as they were talking, Gary Bettman brought this up almost as an afterthought to Pelly. And Pelly is the complete opposite of Moore, by the way. Very sort of enthusiastic, impulsive guy, and a very aggressive guy. He was buying up, along with Moore, a lot of sports properties for Sportsnet at that time and trying to give TSN a run for its money. So Gary Bettman at one point said something like, well, I don't suppose there is this gatekeeper model we're looking at. I don't suppose that'd be something you're interested in, is it? And right away, Pelly said, yeah, we would. And we'll take a look at it. And Pelly told me, he said, all Gary really did was take the cover off the bid book, which was the booklet summing up what they were looking for, because it had TSN on the cover, and handed it over to him and said, well, okay, here you go, have a look at it. So they went and had a look and studied, and then, even more important, talked to the big wigs at Rogers and got their approval to make this kind of bid, and came back and said, yeah, this is something we're interested in. And then from there, the sort of cloak and dagger stuff kind of started, where their plan was to let Rogers lay in the weeds and then make a bid after TSN did, so that they could push the NHL and say, here's our bid. It's it's a little more in Bell, so you need to take it or we'll pull it off the table.
And Pelly is deliberately telling people, no, we're not interested.
Yeah, both of them were saying, they were saying because broadcast industry is very small. Everybody knows everybody. They've all worked at each other's networks. So they're always running into each other. And they would tell the Bell guys, I don't know if we're interested in those NHL rights. They're pretty pricey, maybe a Sunday package. So they were just sort of laying in the weeds, letting everybody think, oh, okay, they're not much of a threat.
So this is the best part of this story. It made me laugh with some of the colorful quotations that are in your book about when this deal goes down. So this is Grey Cup weekend in Regina, Saskatchewan. Bell owns the CFL rights, exclusive CFL rights. So everybody's in Regina for the party from Bell. And meantime, Keith Pelly, Scott Moore, and the president of Rogers, which is another
Nadir
angle,
Mohammed,
Nadir Mohammed, are in New York City cutting a one-page deal that essentially is $5.2 billion
Yeah.
over 12 years, and we have a handshake, and let's go and
Yeah.
announce this. That must have been one heck of a shock for Bell.
It was a tremendous shock. And as one of them told me later, he said, yeah, we're all freezing our asses off in Regina while we're getting
We'll cut that from the audio.
But that's the exact quote. I begged the guy to let me put his name on it. And the best I could do was get him to let me use it without his name. And he's a very colorful broadcaster, a very helpful guy in the book. But he still does business, I guess, with some of those guys. But that's exactly what was happening. Is while these guys were the TSN guys were partying up in Regina, Scott Moore and Keith Pelley and Nadir Mohammed were cutting a deal out from under Bell with Bettman in New York, and that's what happened. And there was one other part of that another tactical move by Scott Moore that was brilliant, and it was also, he was able to do it because he knew Bettman through his job at the CBC. He knew what Bettman was like, and he was able to take advantage of a key mistake by both CBC and Bell, and that was that Scott Moore knew Gary Bettman had a very, very acute sense of his own importance and the importance of the NHL, which basically meant when he was negotiating a major deal, he wanted to be sitting across the table from the most important person at that company. He didn't want to be dealing with a flunky, if you could refer to a president as a flunky. And Moore knew that. So when they decided that, okay, we're going to get serious, we're going to go after this gatekeeper thing, Moore insisted. He said, Nadir Mohammed, the CEO of Rogers, has to be at the table. And that is number one, that you have to have him there. Because by this time, first the CBC had made the mistake of not having its top executive, Hubert Lacroix. What happened was when they were starting their negotiating period, they had a breakfast meeting in Toronto with Hubert Lacroix and the two guys who were handling the negotiations, Jeffrey Orridge and Neil McEnany, and they met with Gary Bettman, John Collins, and the Deputy Commissioner, Bill Daly. And essentially, at the end of the meeting, Lacroix said to Bettman and company, well, you're in good hands now, and I'll see you again when we have the press conference, i.e. the press conference to announce the deal. Well, Bettman and Collins were just absolutely astonished. They couldn't believe it. You mean you're not going to be part of this? You're the president. No, these guys will look after you. And that did not go over well. And then later on, when it was Bell's turn, George Cope, who is the CEO of Bell Canada, he did the same thing. He said, he wasn't going to be part of this. Now, him and Bettman already had a bad relationship because Cope, as CEO of Bell, was already on the board of directors of Maple Leaf Sports and Entertainment. And in that role, he had interactions with Bettman over NHL matters like the lockout and the collective agreement. And of course, the Leafs did not want the lockout. As a wealthy team, they didn't see the need for it. And Cope had already lectured Bettman a few times, including one occasion. Cope is an old basketball player. He's about 6'8". I think most of you are aware, Gary Bettman is not 6'8". He is probably 5'5", and Cope was doing this to him. And it was not a good look in a governor's meeting. And so they did not have a good relationship. However, Bettman still expected that guy should be across the table. And he wasn't. And that, it wasn't enough I should make clear, that's not enough to scuttle the deal. Like, one thing about Gary Bettman, he never lets personal issues get in the way of business. Business is number one with him. That's, all he's interested in is what he can maximize for the league. However, it did play a role ultimately when, the overall decision had to be made. It made it easier for him to do. And it was, in the end, Bettman's own sole decision. He was the only guy. He didn't consult anyone else. He was the one who decided Rogers was getting the deal. and that played a role.
One kind of ironic twist I find in this is that Bell and Rogers both are part owners of the Toronto Maple Leafs. Can you imagine that boardroom after this deal gets done?
It was very, very frosty. Yeah, it Maple Leaf MLSE board meetings where it was the way that it was described to me by somebody who was in the room for at least one of them was that it was very polite, but very icy. A very icy atmosphere, and because the TSN guys were really bitter, the Beast and the Bell, like by extension the Bell guys, because they thought that as the existing rights holders, because they had that other national package, that at the very least Bettman should have come back to them and given them a chance to match Rogers, and Bettman refused, and it got to the point where John Collins and Bill Daley thought so too, and they tried to talk Bettman after he had made the decision into at least calling George Cope and giving him a chance to offer or match the offer. And it actually got fairly heated, and Bettman refused. He said, "It's my decision," and he basically told those two guys that if you don't agree, this is a firing offense. If you're going to make an issue out of this, he said, "I've made my decision, and that's it."
So a couple of pieces on this. Gary Bettman called Hubert Lacroix of CBC, the president, on November 21st, 2013. So this is right on the heels of the deal being struck at the Grey Cup. While everybody's at the Grey Cup game, tells him, "You're out." Rogers has the NHL deal. I want to talk about Quebec Corps because they're important to this.
Yeah.
And then George Cope actually tries to still find a way to convince the Board of Governors don't approve this deal. He's down with the governor's lobbying. So what happened?
Now that was something I found out over the course of doing the book, because I covered all this mostly for the Globe and Mail. I was for a couple of years I was a sports media writer. I took a break from hockey, and this story hadn't come out until it's the interesting thing when you're doing a book as opposed to writing for a newspaper. If you're talking to people and they know whatever they're telling you is going to appear in the paper the next day, they're not inclined, unless they got an axe to grind. That's usually the way you get good scoops. Somebody's got an axe to grind and wants to get it out there. But they're less inclined to give you what's really happened, like something juicy, because it's a little too fresh. It's going to be in the paper the next day. And as you know, your source is quite likely in the middle of the story, and somebody's going to start looking at him or her and like, "Were you the one who blabbed?" sort of thing. But a couple of years go by, and then you come back and you say, "Well, I'm writing a book." Then they tend to lay a little more on you, and that's exactly what happened there. A lot of these guys were more inclined to tell me some interesting bits, like this thing I'm going to relate in a second about Cope. And it really, really made for a far more interesting story than I thought at the time when I was simply doing it for the Globe. So what happened was, through the MLSC board, word got back to George Cope that Rogers had swiped the deal. Okay, somebody in the NHL had whispered in the ear of somebody on the board of MLSE that, Bell's out. And they went running right to Cope. And so Cope had the opportunity now that, okay, you could, like they told him, get on a plane, get down to New York and try and talk Bettman out of this. Throw some more money at him. And Cope refused at that point. He said no. I think part of it was he didn't really want to spend that $5.2 billion he'd already bid on. And this was going to cost him a little more, because not long before that, they had bought up, I believe it was the chain called Astral.
Yes.
Radio stations and TV. Mm-hmm. And they'd paid quite a bit for that. They paid $3 or $4 billion, I think, for that chain. And so this $5.2 billion was going to be another drain on the share price, probably. And so at that point, he said no. Well, then the big shock comes. Rogers has got the deal, and Cope sees what a great storm this has caused across the country and has second thoughts. Now, technically, the deal isn't quite Rogers yet, because it may have been announced in late November, but no deal is official until it's been actually approved by a vote of the Board of Governors. And that wasn't going to happen for a couple weeks. They have, in the first week of December, is their annual, what they call the annual Board of Governors meeting. That's when some work actually gets done. They meet for 2 days, is somewhere warm. One year it's in Florida, the next year it's usually California or Arizona. And this is where the vote was going to be done. So Cope realizes, I got 2 weeks. Technically, maybe I can lobby the governors and, either get Gary to reconsider or hold up the process in some fashion. The problem was, we get back to Gary being the smartest guy in the room. No decision that Gary makes has ever been overturned by the Board of Governors. And every vote is always unanimous because he works the back room like nobody else. And so if there's an unpopular issue, he simply never brings it to a vote until he's got everybody on side. So every vote is unanimous. But Cope, being a very stubborn guy himself, flew down to Florida ahead of that meeting and started lobbying governors. And he made enough noise that the morning of the meeting, Gary called Keith Pelley from Rogers Media, who was to make the presentation to the Board of Governors, and said, meet me at 7 o'clock for breakfast. And he told Pelley, George Cope is down here, you may have heard, and he's lobbying the governors. But he said, I just want to tell you, this deal is done. Don't worry about him. It's a done deal. You go make your presentation. When that's done, we're going to vote, and you're going to have the deal. And that's exactly what happened.
And it was unanimous, except the Leafs, who
yeah,
abstained
it was
because both companies own them.
Right. The vote was 29-0, like all Gary Bettman votes, and with the Leafs abstaining, which actually made sense. Some of my media pals made a big deal out of this, but I just thought, well, that makes sense because the Leafs are majority owned by both companies who are both fighting over this deal, and they're voting on a contract that conferred a direct benefit on one of those owners. So, of course, you should abstain. It only makes sense.
I want to keep us moving. Quebecor is interesting because Rogers pays $5.2 billion, but in fact, they actually pay $3.7 billion because of Quebecor.
That's the one aspect of this story that really gets underreported. I devoted a chapter to it in this. And when I started reporting this, when I was talking to people like John Collins and Keith Pelley, they emphasized to me, don't play down the involvement of Quebecor in this, the French for the French language television rights. Or actually, they bought the French version of the the Gatekeeper Model. So they got all the digital rights, everything that was in French. And they both told me, Collins and Pelley, that this deal doesn't get done unless Quebecor, and specifically a guy named Pierre Dion, who at that time was president of what's the TVA, the French network. He was so enthusiastic about the idea of buying the subcontracting the French rights. He talked Pelladeau's people at Quebecor into paying a total of over 12 years about $1.3 to $1.4 billion, and that worked out to about, I think, $130 million a year. For the French rights. So even before Rogers signed a check, they knew that it wasn't going to cost them $5.2 billion. It was going to cost them $3.7 because they had this money coming in from Quebecor. And if that hadn't happened, the people the bigwigs at Rogers, i.e. the Rogers family, since they still really control the company through their voting shares, and Nadir Mohammed would never have approved that kind of expenditure unless they knew there was a huge whack of cash coming back from Quebecor. Now, the thing is, Bell couldn't do that kind of deal because they already owned a French network, RDS, and whereas Rogers did not. Quebecor had TVA, that was a separate network, and they were fortunate that TVA was in its first couple of years. So they were very aggressive in wanting to buy programming to take on RDS. And so it was a perfect opportunity, and the Rogers guys played it for all it was worth. And it made the crucial difference in getting that deal.
Before we get into George Stroumboulopoulos and the failed experiment as the host of Hockey Night in Canada, I just
This
wanna-
looks like a real George Stroumboulopoulos
Yeah,
crowd.
Stroumbo is easier to say, Stroumboulopoulos. Let me just say, ask you this. After the CBC loses the rights, essentially they lose control of Hockey Night in Canada through this deal.
Yeah.
It's like a bomb at the CBC headquarters, and the
Yeah,
deal,
very much so.
yeah, the deal that gets cut has to happen within 48 hours. So what
Yeah.
happens? What's the impact on CBC? And then I'm going to run a clip because not
Okay.
everybody at the CBC agrees with you.
Well, the ones who still got jobs, yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, what happened was, of course, along with, remember I said that the TSN guys on Grey Cup weekend were very confident they were going to get the new deal. Well, so were the CBC people. And they were telling their underlings, i.e. people I knew, that, right up to the night before the deal, oh yeah, we're still going to be part of Hockey Night in Canada. Although by this time, in retrospect, those CBC guys were doing some spin doctoring because, yeah, as it turned out, they were part of it, but they weren't getting any money. But they left that part out when they were spinning this deal. But it went off like a bomb the next day because people realized once they heard the terms, wait a minute, the CBC's not getting any money out of this deal. They're getting nothing. Rogers is getting all the advertising money. And that led to even more. There were already layoffs planned at the CBC because they were dealing with cutbacks by the Harper government. And on top of that, they had the same problems the private broadcasters had. That advertising revenue was declining across the board because viewership was declining. And so they had to fight, they were getting a sort of double whammy. And the toll in jobs was just tremendous. And it's hard to put a number on it because in the broadcasting industry, there's a lot of different classifications of jobs. Whereas like to take Hockey Night in Canada, for example, there's probably 200 people involved every week in putting Hockey Night in Canada on, but probably only about 20 to 30 of them were actual employees, full-time employees of the CBC. The rest were freelancers or people on contract. There were different categories, like the announcers, for example, Ron and Don. They were sort of considered CBC employees, but they were actually under contract. And they, if they had the right contract, they could go work somewhere else in the summer if they wanted, that sort of thing. But all of the technical people, or a lot of them, were like the sound guys and the video editors and those kind of guys. They were freelancers. And they would basically get known in the business, and they would work, say, 4 times a week on hockey broadcasts, but each time it might be for a new person. And it was often common back when the Globe and Mail still traveled with the Maple Leafs. You'd get to know these guys and women over the course of a season, and you'd run into one of them, say, 3 times a week in the airport, and each time they were working for somebody else. One week it might be a TSN game they were headed out to, or the next week it might be a Rogers game, like a regional game, and that's how they made their living. And it's a good living too, but once you're known, they come to you. But those people then suddenly weren't getting the calls anymore, so these jobs disappeared, and it was devastating for a lot of people.
And Rogers took over the whole 8th floor and the studio and everything.
Yeah,
at
I
CBC,
mean,
right?
I always like to say this was the sort of literal barbarians at the gate, because what happened was once the CBC compounded the mistake of not forming a partnership with either Rogers or Bell to get a piece of it, or not taking the NHL's offer of a scaled-down version of Hockey Night in Canada. Once they realized they lost the whole thing to Rogers, well, Keith Pelly pulled off a great bluff. He went to the CBC and said, here's the deal. You're going to provide us your technical people for free. We'll work out a dollar value. We don't have studio space for what we got in mind, but you do. So you're going to give us studio and office space for free, rent free, and we're going to keep all the advertising revenue. You get nothing, but in exchange, you get to show the games for 4 years with an option on a 5th. And the CBC, instead of saying, well, wait a minute, where's your over-the-air network? What if we say no? Where are you going to show the games? You don't have CTV like Bell does. All they had was City. Remember City? And City didn't have a presence in Atlantic Canada, and they only had stations in some of the main cities in the rest of the country. And Pelly told me later, he said, if they'd have told me to take a hike, he said, what was I going to do? The only thing I could have done was turn around and ask Global, and Global didn't have nearly the reach the CBC does across the country. But instead, the CBC people, after quibbling a bit, just basically said, oh, okay. And so there it went. The show that once provided about half of their English language advertising revenue, it went up in smoke and they got nothing.
Okay, I want to talk about Stroumboulopoulos, but before we do that, on this point about how devastating the impact was, according to your book, for the CBC, Chuck Thompson, head of public affairs for the CBC, was on TVO last week with Steve Paikin of The Agenda. This is after your interview. Obviously, the CBC saw it and reacted this way, and this is on the question of the impact of the CBC.
We got about a minute and change left for you to comment on that.
We made, on a really good year, when the Leafs and or other Canadian teams made the playoffs, and as you said, went deep, $130 million. We were paying $105 million in the latter part of the last agreement. Did we make some money then? Of course we did, but not to the tune that he suggests. To replace hockey, and if we turned down Keith Pelly and said, no, we're not doing anything with you, to replace it, the $400 million when you think about every Saturday night through the regular season, plus April, May, and a good chunk of June.
Yeah.
Significant replacement costs. We don't have to do that anymore. And we get to keep hockey on CBC, fully recognizing it's the Rogers rights, but people can still watch hockey on the public broadcaster. And hockey and CBC became, we used to say we had a 60-year date with Canadian hockey fans every Saturday night and right through the spring, and we still do.
And you still do.
Well, he's doing a nice little bit of dancing there, probably worthy of Mitch Marner, where you noticed right at the start of the clip, he kind of slipped it in there that we made $130 million on the... Now, it is true, and I even covered that in the book, that by the end of the contract, when they were paying $105 million, they weren't exactly making a killing on hockey, but it was still by far the most profitable program on the network, because your average network drama program, you lose money. It costs, I believe, for 1 hour of a drama, about $260,000, I think. I might be a little off, the figures are in the book. But the absolute most you can recoup in advertising money for that drama, for that hour, is about $200. And that's if it's a big hit. So the best you can do with drama is a $60,000 loss per hour. And so he's not wrong in that the cost of replacing the hours that Hockey Night took up was enormous. And there were various estimates. What he gave, I think he said 200 to 300 million. That's kind of on the high side, because basically what you'd have to replace is all the prime time on Saturday night. But most crucially, at playoff time in the spring, you're on every night for 2.5 months. And that time of year also happens to be the ratings period for all the major networks. And that's when, you take the ratings, that's when you want your highest ratings, because the rates you charge advertisers are based on those spring ratings. And that's where the CBC would have taken a hit. What they could have done during the season was show old movies on Saturday night, right? Somebody might watch. They'll sell an ad or two and they won't get killed. Where they would run into trouble, and they had been terrified about this for a number of years, is filling that big gap in the spring. Although I don't think it was as severe as 300 million. I think somewhere maybe 100 to 200, which is still pretty significant. But remember, he did admit they made 130 million. And that 130 million was every year. That paid for a lot of other programs that got canceled. So, he accused me of playing fast and loose. Well, two can play that game. Right?
All right, I'm going to wrap up with just this. Rogers takes over. It's a glitzy new set. They're obviously going for a younger crowd.
Yep.
The interview we showed earlier in the night, the Ron MacLean, Gary Bettman conflict, plays into the decision to bring George Stroumboulopoulos in. They wanted James Duthie, but Duthie, TSN anteed up to keep him.
Well, and also he was an Ottawa guy, by the way, Duthie. He was very loyal to TSN because they gave him his big break, and that's how he got famous nationally. And so he felt a real obligation that if they still wanted him, he wanted to stay there. And by the way, James Duthie was the first choice to replace Ron. There was no way Ron was going to stay in his job. I mean, we've been through all this with Bettman and all that. And with this contract, Bettman and Daly and Collins said, nobody's going to be running things on Hockey Night the way the CBC did. You guys will basically do what we say or else. And so you knew there's no way Ron was going to survive in that. But Pelly and Moore wanted Duthie. That was their first choice because he was simply the best host for hockey at that time. He was a little younger than Ron. He's not that much younger than Ron, probably 5 or 6 years, be my guess. But crucially, he didn't have kind of Ron's weaker points like the puns and the over familiarity with people and the sort of that hokey sort of sense of humor. His sense of humor is pretty sharp, but even better is that he was as well versed in the hockey issues as Ron was, but he could do it in a much more lighthearted fashion.
George Stroumboulopoulos could not do that.
No, George was hired because he was a hip young. And he wasn't even that young. That's the other thing. George himself insisted, pointed this out at his first press conference. He said, you guys keep calling me this young guy. He was like 43, 44 at the time. The problem was he dressed 20 years younger than he was. He had a 20-something wardrobe, and he's a middle-aged guy, and he's got the soul patch and the earring and all this. Now, the average crowd that watched Hockey Night in Canada, which would be, I'm going to say, much like the guys in this room, I don't think they were quite ready for going from Ron MacLean to George Stroumboulopoulos. But it was worse because George, you knew right away when you were watching him that he wasn't as well versed in hockey as Ron MacLean. He was sort of a somewhat enthusiastic fan whose knowledge was kind of thin in spots. And it started to come out. Now, the other thing, though, is that doesn't mean he wasn't a good broadcaster. He is an excellent broadcaster. You saw that in interviews because he's a very skilled interviewer. That's where he was at his best, doing interviews.
But the wrong fit and the Angus Reid polls were pretty...
it
forced Rogers to make a move and bring back MacLean.
Now, all of this, of course, was made worse by the fact that as this was happening in the first 2 years of the Rogers deal, all the Canadian NHL teams got crappy together, right? Led by the Leafs. And so hockey fans were very, very angry anyway. And so this gave them one more thing to bitch about. Ron and George and what bring back Ron. So that, I think, sped up the whole process.
David, I'm going to end here. Last question of the night. This is the biggest Canadian sports broadcasting deal in the history of professional sports outside of the Olympics.
Yep. Oh, yeah, by far.
But was it a good deal for Rogers?
I'll tell you the day it expires. You know what? In the end, I think it will be. Because I don't think... They may not end up making money over the 12 years, but they're not going... I'm fairly sure they're not going to lose their shirt either. It might be somewhere in between. But the money wasn't the only reason they did this. They wanted to make Sportsnet the #1 sports network in Canada because ever since Sportsnet came along in 1998, they were a distant #2 in the ratings to TSN. And this, aided by the unexpected resurgence of the Blue Jays a couple years ago, this did put them over the top. They like to interpret ratings different, but it's sort of the measuring stick of the #1 network is done month by month, where which network has the highest average audience over the month. And for the first time, once the Blue Jays started winning in the fall of, was that 2015?
Seems like a distant memory,
Yeah,
doesn't it?
we get my age. I can't
Yeah.
the years just got run together. That really helped. And then combined, as the Leafs came out of their swoon in the next couple of years, they now generally run ahead of TSN in the monthly ratings. Now, it's not it's not like they've now gone to what TSN used to be, like well ahead of them. No, it's a little more close than that, because TSN they're no dummies. They decided to take what they called the championship approach. So they loaded up on other properties that were available that were nice champions, like the Masters, the U.S. Open, the World Cup, Soccer World Cup, those kind of big championships. And those things still pull in pretty significant ratings. And by the way, both of those networks were profitable from day one, even Sportsnet when they were a distant second. So they both remain profitable. And the TSN guys now say to you, oh, that's the best thing that ever happened to us because we don't have to pay that $5.2 billion. And they like to leave out the part like, well, yeah, but you guys were the first ones to ante up $5.2 billion until you got outbid.
Well, I'll close with this. It's interesting to me that 5 years into this mega deal, the three men who essentially did the deal for Rogers are all gone.
They're all gone, yeah.
None of them work at Rogers anymore.
You know what? It is actually hard to draw a line between the two, because Nadir Mohammed had already announced that he was going when they started negotiating the deal. Keith Pelley, if you look at his career, always gets out when the going's good. He's a smart guy, and sometimes he'd jump out, like he's gone back and forth between Sportsnet and TSN 2 or 3 times before he landed at Sportsnet the final time. Another time he left for 2 years, and I can't remember if he was at Sportsnet or TSN when he did this. He's a huge football fan. And he decided to go be president of the Toronto Argonauts, even though compared to what he was making in TV, it wasn't comparable money, just because he loved CFL football. So he did that for 2 years. Then he got back into television. And what happened here was a tremendous opportunity. He is now running the European tour. And he gets a house in London on a really swank golf course. Now, London real estate is even pricier than Toronto real estate. So, and he loves golf even more than he loves football. So he'll tell you, I couldn't turn this down when it came his way. So you can't draw a line there. And Scott Moore insists that it was his decision to step down, that he's not a guy who likes running an existing business, which is sort of what Sportsnet is now, because they got the NHL for another 7 years. I can't even keep track. And he says that he'll probably be back soon with a startup. And talking to people over there, I have no reason to disbelieve him. The other sign is they gave him a big send-off at Sportsnet. Like, he was on Bob McCown's show. He was on all the other talk shows for the last 2 weeks. Broadcasters don't do that. If they're shipping you out the door with here's the check, get lost, you don't get to say goodbye like that in that business. And he did. So I tend to believe him when he says it was, his idea and he's looking for a change.
All right. Thank you for writing the book. It's a fascinating story about a mega broadcasting deal. Thanks for
I
coming.
won't say it was fun. Writing books isn't fun, but
You're right.
it's fun when it's finished.
Yes, you are right. All right. David Shoalts, Globe and Mail. Thanks very much for coming
you.
to Pembroke. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. You want to take questions?
Yeah, we're going to take some questions. So